"Can I order a toast, please?" The words left Harlan's lips soft yet deliberate as he stood at the counter of his restaurant. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and a baseball cap, no one recognized him for who he truly was. The space around him felt cold and lifeless. Empty tables sat in silence, the hum of chatter long gone. The harsh overhead lights flickered faintly, adding to the sense of abandonment that clung to the walls. Mary at the counter wiped the same spot again and again, her movements, mechanical eyes distant, her smile a facade for the exhaustion beneath. In the kitchen, Sam worked without pause, but his face betrayed a subtle tension as if carrying a burden no one could see. Harlan stood still watching. A sharp discomfort pricked at him, an unfamiliar heaviness. Something was off. This wasn't the place he had built. What do you think will happen next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to join the adventure. Harlan stood behind the counter, blending in with the employees as though he were just another worker. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and baseball cap, he was virtually invisible, unnoticed by the staff. He worked alongside Mary, who tirelessly wiped down surfaces, her smile a fragile mask hiding the exhaustion in her eyes. Her movements were mechanical, and yet she never stopped. Sam in the kitchen worked with a quiet intensity, his hands moving swiftly as he prepared food. But there was a nervousness in his eyes, as though he was hiding something deep inside. As Harlan observed them both, a subtle tension lingered in the air, unspoken and pervasive. The restaurant, usually a bustling haven of activity, now felt like a hollow shell. The once vibrant atmosphere had been replaced with an unshakable quiet, as if the air itself was heavy with resignation. Despite their hard work, the staff seemed detached, their interactions minimal, as though they no longer saw each other. This place, once full of warmth and energy, now felt cold and distant. Harlan realized the stark contrast between what he had imagined this place to be and the harsh reality the employees faced daily. No one had ever really acknowledged their struggles. He wondered how long it had been this way and how he had failed to see it until now. As Harlan worked side by side with Sam, the silence between them grew heavy. Sam was quiet at first, absorbed in his work, but eventually the weight of the day seemed to break through his guarded exterior. Slowly, he began to open up about his life. His voice faltered as he spoke of his mother, gravely ill, fighting a battle with cancer. He couldn't afford the treatment she needed and felt too ashamed to ask for help. "I don't want anyone to think I'm weak," he admitted quietly, eyes cast downward, avoiding Harlan's gaze. There was a rawness to Sam's words, a vulnerability that Harlan had not expected. As Sam spoke, Harlan felt the stark difference between the facade of this bustling establishment and the personal tragedies its workers silently carried. Mary, too, had a story to tell, one she kept hidden beneath her constant cheer. Harlan noticed the tightness in her smile whenever the topic of family came up. Her eyes, though, told a different story, one of weariness and sorrow. As the weight of their words settled into him, Harlan began to grasp the depth of the divide between the life he had been living and the one his employees had been enduring. He could no longer deny the dissonance between the image of the restaurant he had built and the reality of what it had become for those on the front lines. The tension in the air grew thicker the next morning. Sam, as usual, worked diligently, but this time he was met with harsh reprimands from a superior for a mistake that wasn't his fault. Harlan, standing just outside the kitchen, watched as Sam silently took the scolding. His shoulders hunched, his face tense with frustration, but masked by an obedient silence. Harlan could feel the frustration bubbling inside him, but he remained rooted to the spot, unsure of how to intervene. His gaze then shifted to Mary, still smiling as she greeted customers, but her eyes were far from cheerful. Every time they locked eyes, a brief flicker of sadness crossed her face, quickly hidden behind the mask of professionalism. Harlan saw it clearly now, the emotional exhaustion, the hidden pain that no one addressed. These employees, working tirelessly under oppressive conditions, had no outlet for their suffering. Harlan felt the weight of their unspoken struggles, and the guilt of not having seen it sooner began to gnaw at him. He had created a company where the employees' well-being was secondary, And now, standing on the outside, he could no longer ignore the damage he had allowed to happen. Yet, despite all this, he still found himself frozen in indecision, unable to take action. The realization stung. He had witnessed countless failures, but never once had he found the courage to confront them. Harlan couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that crept in with each passing day. Every moment he spent observing his employees, he became more aware of the deep inequalities in the system he had built. The restaurant he had worked so hard to establish had become a cold, indifferent place, and he was partly to blame. While working beside Mary, he saw the weight she carried. She was always smiling, always serving customers, but Harlan could see it. She was drowning in her personal struggles. She had never asked for help, and that made her feel even more isolated. As Mary casually spoke about her life, Harlan listened, but it wasn't just her words. It was the way she spoke, the sadness in her eyes, that struck him the hardest. The guilt grew heavier with each story shared. Harlan knew he had the power to change things, yet the fear of disrupting everything made him hesitate. Every time he tried to find a way to justify his inaction, the weight of his guilt only deepened. The realization came in waves, pulling him deeper into reflection. He wasn't just a witness to their suffering. He was a participant. And with that knowledge, the burden of guilt became a catalyst for a change he was beginning to realize he had to make. Harlan's eyes were slowly being opened, and the truth was harder to ignore with each passing day. He began to pay more attention to the way his employees interacted with one another. There was no warmth between them, just tired exchanges of words. Mary, despite always greeting customers with a practiced smile, didn't seem to enjoy the work anymore. Her body language was stiff, her smile forced. Sam in the kitchen looked increasingly worn out, but no one seemed to notice or care. They moved through the motions of the day like shadows of themselves. The air in the restaurant was thick, not with the buzz of conversation, but with exhaustion. Even when the shift ended, there was no relief. The employees filed out without any joy, each one seemingly waiting for the day to end, but not knowing how to get out of the cycle. Harlan's growing awareness made him uncomfortable. He overheard a conversation between Sam and Mary, both of them worried about their futures, one overwhelmed by medical bills, the other struggling to care for her children. The realization hit him hard. These were not just employees, these were people living in survival mode, caught in a system that never gave them a chance to breathe. He felt a profound connection to them, but more than that, he felt a deep responsibility for their suffering. It was no longer just about running a business, it was about changing lives. As Harlan spent more time working alongside his staff, he started noticing how the managers treated them. It was harsh, dismissive, and often downright cruel. A small mistake was met with sharp criticism, and the lack of empathy from the management team only deepened his growing discomfort. One afternoon, Harlan watched as Sam was reprimanded for something that wasn't his fault. Harlan stood in the corner watching the scene unfold, his heart sinking with each harsh word directed at Sam. There was no acknowledgement of his hard work, no understanding of his situation. Harlan's chest tightened as he stood there, paralyzed by the need to intervene, but unsure how. The silence between him and the employees was deafening, their pain hanging in the air. It wasn't just the managers. It was the entire system that had allowed this kind of treatment to thrive. Mary, once so full of energy, was now visibly drained, and it was clear that the constant strain was wearing her down. Harlan felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. The disparity between what he thought his company represented and what it had become was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a business problem, it was a moral one. Harlan had created an environment that lacked compassion, and the guilt of that realization began to weigh heavily on him. He was a leader, but he had failed to lead with heart. The question of whether he could change anything now lingered in his mind, and for the first time he wondered if he had the strength to do so. One day, as Harlan stood waiting for his toast, a quiet whisper from the kitchen made him freeze. "They beat my mom. She's dying." Sam's voice barely audible, as if he had uttered it more for himself than for anyone else. The words cut through the air, reverberating in Harlan's mind long after they were spoken. He stood still, stunned as the weight of those words settled into him. It was a truth that was both foreign and harsh, one that completely shattered the surface of what he thought he knew about his employees. Harlan felt the floor beneath him shift. He couldn't process what he had just heard. It was as though the world had paused for a moment, forcing him to confront the silent suffering around him. The realization was both jarring and illuminating. His workers weren't just struggling with their jobs, they were carrying heavy burdens outside of it. The revelation hit Harlan like a tidal wave, crashing through his self-perception and his understanding of the environment he had created. For the first time, he saw beyond the masks, beyond the smiles and the routine, into the pain that was buried deep within his employees. And in that instant, Harlan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After the whisper, Harlan returned to his work, but the heaviness in his chest was unshakable. Sam's words lingered like an invisible weight, pulling his focus away from the tasks at hand. As he moved through the day, he began to watch his employees differently. He noticed the way they greeted customers with forced cheerfulness, the way they exchanged brief words with one another but never really connected. They were just going through the motions, no energy, no enthusiasm, nothing that resembled the passion he once saw in his business. Every time he locked eyes with them, a quiet sadness hung in the air. Sam, working in the kitchen, looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Mary, though always smiling at customers, showed signs of mental exhaustion as she worked. Harlan saw it now, the despair hidden behind their eyes. He realized the vast gulf between his world and theirs was wider than he had ever imagined. The employees were drowning in struggles he had never noticed before. Harlan couldn't get their faces out of his mind. Each one of them was a story of survival, of pain, masked by the duty to keep going. The divide between their realities and his was sharp, and for the first time he felt a deep unease about his place in it all. Harlan couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The guilt was unbearable. He knew he had to act, but the fear of disrupting the fragile balance of his company still held him back. During a break, he approached Sam, his heart pounding. "How's your mom?" Harlan asked, his voice gentler than usual. Sam hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously, but then he began to speak. His voice cracked as he revealed the true extent of his mother's illness, cancer, and no money to pay for the treatment. The words tumbled out in a rush, and Harlan listened in disbelief. It was a reality Harlan had never fully understood, one he had been blind to all along. The shock of it left him speechless. His heart ached for Sam, for the life he was living, but more than that, Harlan realized how little he had done to truly help. The weight of his failure settled heavily in his chest. But then something shifted. The helplessness he felt transformed into something else, a sense of responsibility. He wasn't sure how he could help, but he knew he had to. It was the first time Harlan had truly stepped out of his comfort zone, realizing that change wouldn't come from observation alone. He had to act, even if it meant confronting the systems he had put in place, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. After the apology, Harlan knew it wasn't enough to simply address the immediate issue. He called for a meeting with all the staff, determined to create an open space where they could voice their opinions and concerns. As the employees gathered, there was an undercurrent of nervousness, but also a sense of cautious hope. For the first time, they were being given a platform, a moment to share their truths. Sam and Mary, among others, spoke about the challenges they faced, the invisible burdens they carried while working. Mary, usually so composed, allowed a brief moment of vulnerability as she described the toll her life was taking. Sam, too, opened up, revealing his struggles with his mother's illness and his own fear of being judged. Harlan listened intently, jotting down notes, not interrupting, but absorbing every word. It was a stark contrast to the usual top-down communication he had implemented in the past. Yet, just as he began to feel a shift in the atmosphere, the board members' objections were loud and clear. They argued that these changes could cost too much, potentially undermining the company's profits. Harlan, however, stood firm. He reiterated his belief that employees were the company's most valuable asset, and that change was necessary for long-term sustainability. The tension between the board and Harlan was palpable, but he didn't waver. His decision to prioritize the well-being of his employees over profit marked a turning point. This was more than just a meeting. It was a stand for the kind of leadership he wanted to embody. Despite his determination, Harlan soon found that implementing change was not without its challenges. The board's resistance grew louder, with many of the directors questioning his plans. They argued that increasing wages and improving working conditions would negatively impact profits, pushing the company into financial jeopardy. The tension in the boardroom was thick. Harlan presented his case, logically laying out the long-term benefits, but his words were met with skepticism and harsh criticism. Some of the board members even accused him of sabotaging the very company he had worked so hard to build. Harlan felt the sting of their words, the weight of their doubts pressing down on him. He knew they were right about one thing: this would be a gamble. The stakes were high, and failure could cost him everything. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, Harlan couldn't shake the responsibility he felt for the people who depended on him. He was standing at a crossroads, torn between maintaining the status quo for the sake of the company's immediate success or taking a risk to create a more humane, sustainable future for his employees. It was a decision he couldn't take lightly, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to take the chance to stand by what he knew was right, even if it meant risking everything. Harlan refused to back down. The resistance he faced from the board only fueled his determination to make real change. He continued to meet with his staff, listening to their stories, their needs, and their hopes for a better future. These conversations began to sow the seeds of transformation within the company. Sam, though still worried about whether the company would truly be able to follow through with the changes, began to feel a glimmer of hope. Mary, who had once been skeptical, started to share more openly with Harlan about her aspirations. She talked about her dreams not just for herself but for the company, and Harlan promised her he would do everything in his power to make those dreams a reality. With each conversation, a shift occurred, slowly, imperceptibly, but it was happening. Employees once resigned to their roles started to feel like they had a stake in the future of the company. They felt seen, heard, and valued for the first time in a long while. The energy in the workplace began to change. The once heavy air now felt lighter, filled with potential. Harlan realized that this was just the beginning, that real change was a long, difficult process, but he was committed to seeing it through. The fear and doubt that had once clouded his vision were replaced with a sense of purpose. This was his moment to lead, not from the top, but alongside his employees in solidarity. As Harlan pushed forward with his plan to overhaul the company, he quickly realized that the path to change was not as simple as he had imagined. The resistance from the board intensified with every step. They viewed his suggestions like improving working conditions and raising employee wages as dangerous and unnecessary. They argued that the financial burden would be too great, that it would erode the company's profits. At first, Harlan had hoped they would come around, but the force of their opposition felt like a wall he couldn't climb. The board's harsh words left him reeling, and the burden of their criticism weighed heavily on him. He felt the loneliness of his decision, standing at a precipice, unsure if he was making the right choice. Every moment of doubt seemed to drain him, but he couldn't back down now. The thought of abandoning his employees, of betraying them after everything he had seen, was unbearable. Harlan was no longer just fighting for the company, he was fighting for his own integrity. The conflict between what he wanted to do and what the board expected became a constant internal battle. As the pressure mounted, he realized this wasn't just about business. It was about standing up for what was right, even at great personal cost. The fear of losing everything, including his position, was real, but he knew that the true cost would be his own sense of self if he let it go. The breaking point came at the next board meeting. Harlan stood firm, his voice resolute, as he declared that the changes he had proposed would not be reversed. There was no compromise to be made. The opposition from the board was immediate, with several members voicing their dissatisfaction in loud, forceful tones. But Harlan didn't flinch. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt completely sure of his decision. His words were clear, decisive, and full of conviction. He spoke not just for the company but for the employees who had been ignored for far too long. Harlan could feel the weight of the room shift, Some of the board members looked taken aback, others remained cold, but there was no going back. The meeting ended with an air of tension, and Harlan walked out knowing that the path ahead would not be easy. But something in him had changed. He understood now that this journey wasn't just about transforming the company, it was about transforming himself. The decision he had made was bigger than business. It was a test of his character. He had chosen his side, and now there was no turning back. This moment, this decision, would define him. In the aftermath of his decision, the pressure on Harlan only grew. The board was relentless, demanding detailed reports on the company's financial status, openly criticizing his actions, calling them impractical and reckless. The weight of their expectations bore down on him, but Harlan couldn't give up. He knew the road ahead was fraught with difficulty. The board was fighting to preserve their profits, and they saw him as a threat to their control. Yet Harlan was resolute. He refused to back down. The changes he had promised weren't just for the short term, they were for the long-term health of the company for the people who worked there. But with every passing day, the tension mounted. His commitment was beginning to test the very fabric of the company. Harlan started working more closely with the employees, seeking their input, engaging in deep conversations with Sam, Mary, and others. Slowly, he saw a shift in their energy. They felt more connected to the vision he was building. Harlan knew the stakes had never been higher. He was still fighting for his belief in change, but now he had something more. He had the support of the people who mattered most. And that gave him a new strength. The struggle wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about their future, and Harlan would see it through no matter the cost. As Harlan walked through the halls of the restaurant, he could feel the invisible walls between him and his employees. The division was palpable, the tension between the board and the staff mounting with each passing day. The executives began to make subtle moves, restricting benefits, making their opposition to change clear in small, undermining actions. Sam and Mary, both hardworking and dedicated, began to show signs of concern. Harlan noticed the way they carried themselves, their eyes filled with a quiet, creeping worry. They spoke of change, but their voices lacked conviction, as if they no longer believed it was possible. It was an unsettling feeling, watching those he cared for face the weight of uncertainty, knowing that the system he had built was the one crushing them. For the first time, the reality of the divide between the privileged few and the overworked many hit him hard. The emptiness in the eyes of his employees was not just physical exhaustion, it was the toll of a broken system. And as the distance between the leadership and the workers grew, so too did the coldness in Harlan's chest. He felt an overwhelming numbness, a realization that this was not just a business problem, it was a moral one. He had to act, but the weight of doing so was paralyzing. The choice between loyalty to his position and loyalty to his workers was no longer clear. It was as if the ground beneath him was slipping and he didn't know where to land. Harlan sat in his office that evening, staring at the financial reports scattered across his desk. The numbers seemed to blur before him, not because they were complicated, but because they represented everything he was fighting for and everything he was risking. Each figure was a reminder of the company's precarious position, and as he traced the numbers, a cold sweat formed on his brow. The weight of the choice before him was suffocating. On one hand, there was the potential for long-term sustainability through the changes he wanted to make, the kind of future that prioritized employees' well-being, a future he believed in. But on the other, the immediate fallout from the board was undeniable. The risk of financial instability was looming, and the possibility of the company faltering under the strain of his decisions gnawed at him. His mind raced as the internal conflict swirled like a storm. Could he really place his trust in the uncertain path he was forging, or would his idealism cost him everything? He looked around the quiet room, the silence only accentuating the growing tension within him. It was the hardest decision of his life, and the hardest part was the uncertainty. What would the cost be, not just for the company but for the people he had sworn to protect? The guilt that had begun to consume him only deepened. But no matter how much it hurt, Harlan knew there was no turning back now. The time to act had arrived. The meeting was set, and Harlan knew what he had to do. As he stood before the board, the weight of their gazes upon him felt almost suffocating. He could sense the challenge in the air, the doubt and disdain in the eyes of the executives, but he didn't falter. His voice was steady, firm. He was ready to make his stand. "If you cannot accept these changes, then I will step aside. The company can move forward without me." Harlan declared, each word carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. The room fell silent, the shock hanging in the air like a dense fog. The board members exchanged looks of disbelief. Some were visibly angry, while others appeared confused, unable to process the force of Harlan's words. But Harlan remained resolute. This was no longer about simply running a company. This was about standing by his values and ensuring that the workers, those who had given everything for the success of this business, were treated with the respect they deserved. As the meeting unfolded, Harlan noticed the shift in energy. The board's grip on the situation was loosening. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that Harlan was no longer someone to be manipulated. He had crossed a line. It wasn't just about profits anymore. It was about integrity. Outside the boardroom, Sam and Mary, along with the other employees, could feel the change. There was a new sense of hope in the air, a subtle but unmistakable shift. Harlan had chosen his side, and that choice would mark a turning point for all of them. Harlan knew that the road to change would never be without obstacles. The board's opposition was relentless, and each meeting only seemed to deepen the divide between his vision and their resistance. As the pressure mounted, Harlan found himself more determined than ever. He continued to engage with his staff, listening to their concerns and sharing his long-term plans for reform. Sam, though still anxious about whether these changes would ever truly take hold, began to feel the first spark of hope. Mary, who had once been guarded, now spoke up more, offering insights into how the company could improve. These conversations, though small, marked a shift in the atmosphere. There was a sense of unity growing among the employees, an energy Harlan had not seen in a long time. As Harlan walked through the company, he could feel the shift happening slowly but surely. Employees were beginning to take ownership of the changes, their efforts becoming more energized, their commitment to the company growing. The journey was far from over, and there were still many battles to fight. But for the first time, Harlan felt a sense of validation in his decision. Despite the obstacles, the road ahead was starting to look brighter. The change he had hoped for was no longer just an idea, it was becoming a reality, and Harlan knew that he had to keep pushing forward no matter the cost. As the changes began to take hold, Harlan realized the importance of trust. He couldn't do it alone, he needed his employees to believe in the vision. So he gathered the staff for a company-wide meeting, committing to be there for them side by side. It was more than just words, it was a promise to show up for them every step of the way. Sam and Mary, along with their colleagues, began to feel that shift. For the first time, they were being valued not just for their labor, but for their ideas, their contributions. They were no longer just cogs in the machine. They were part of something bigger. Harlan saw the spark in their eyes, the flicker of belief that hadn't been there before. It was a subtle but profound change. As Harlan spoke to them, their faces softened, the walls they had built around themselves starting to crumble. The environment in the company was changing slowly but surely. People were beginning to trust Harlan, and more importantly, they were trusting themselves. This was no longer just about profits. It was about building a company where every individual mattered. And, for the first time, Harlan truly felt like the leader he had always aspired to be. The more Harlan worked alongside his employees, the more he realized that leadership wasn't just about making the tough decisions. It was about empowering others to make decisions of their own. He no longer viewed himself solely as the boss, but as someone who had to set an example, who needed to be a source of inspiration and accountability. As Harlan continued to battle against the board's resistance, he became more and more certain that he was on the right path. He wasn't just fighting for his employees' well-being anymore, he was fighting for the integrity of the company. His leadership was tested daily, but with each step, Harlan grew more confident in his role. Sam, who had once been hesitant and uncertain, now began to step up, showing his own leadership potential. Mary, once shy about speaking up, began contributing ideas that shaped the future of the company. Their growth was a testament to the changes Harlan had initiated. He realized that the true power of leadership lay not in authority, but in the ability to inspire others to believe in themselves. Harlan had learned this lesson the hard way, but now he could see it clearly. His mission was no longer just about transforming the company, it was about transforming the people within it, starting with himself. Harlan knew the time had come to take the next step. He had seen enough to understand that the changes he envisioned were no longer just theoretical, they had to be tested in real life. He initiated a pilot reform program in one of the company's branches, applying everything he had learned from his conversations with the employees. The early results were promising. Sam and Mary, along with their colleagues, felt a sense of ownership in the changes being made. There was a new energy among them, a subtle but unmistakable shift. They worked harder, more efficiently, and with a renewed sense of purpose. But as the improvements began to show, so did the opposition. The executives, steadfast in their traditional ways, continued to criticize and undermine Harlan's efforts. They argued that his reforms would ultimately lead to disaster, jeopardizing profits. The tension between the board and Harlan grew ever more pronounced. Yet, despite the resistance, Harlan held firm. He wasn't simply fighting for immediate results. He was fighting for something much bigger, the belief that a company's success could be measured by its people, not just its bottom line. Even as he felt the pressure mounting, he also felt the weight of something new: hope. The small victories within the branch were tangible proof that change was not only possible, but already underway. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, for the first time, Harlan felt the momentum building. Harlan's momentary sense of victory was short-lived. Despite the initial successes of the reform program, the board's backlash intensified. A key executive, a staunch opponent of Harlan's vision, organized a covert meeting, rallying the other members to push Harlan out of the company. The pressure from within the organization became unbearable. Harlan felt the sharp sting of betrayal. The people he had once trusted were now maneuvering against him, questioning his ability to lead and accusing him of risking the company's future. The weight of their criticisms pressed down on him, and for a moment the doubts began to creep in. Was he really capable of pulling this off? Was the path he had chosen the right one? In a private moment, Harlan allowed himself to feel the isolation. But as the wave of doubt threatened to overtake him, he remembered the promises he had made to his employees, the people who had put their trust in him. He couldn't abandon them now. He would fight for their future, no matter the cost. The conflict reached a boiling point as Harlan steeled himself against the looming threat. The odds were stacked against him, but the realization that he had no other choice made him more determined. It was a fight for more than the company, it was a fight for his values, for his integrity. The tension in the boardroom reached its peak. Harlan, standing before the executives, could feel the weight of their stares. They had pushed him to the brink, attempting to break his resolve, but Harlan was unwavering. His declaration was simple, but it carried the full force of everything he had been working toward. If you cannot accept these changes, I will step down. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment it felt as if time itself had stopped. The shock from the board members was palpable. They hadn't expected Harlan to take such a drastic step, and their faces reflected the surprise, confusion, and even fear of what was happening. They had underestimated him, thinking they could manipulate or control him into submission. But now Harlan had made his stance clear: he would not back down. His words were not just about his position within the company. They were a declaration of the kind of leadership he wanted to embody, a leader who valued people over profit, who believed in doing what was right even when it was hard. As the meeting ended, there was a shift. The executives, now realizing the strength of Harlan's conviction, began to reassess their stance. Some of them started to consider the possibility that Harlan was right. Meanwhile, Harlan felt a new sense of empowerment. The moment marked a turning point. He had made his stand, and he was ready to face whatever came next. His employees, watching from the sidelines, could feel the change. For the first time, Harlan had shown them what it meant to lead with integrity, and that made all the difference. The shift Harlan had fought so hard for began to manifest in small yet undeniable ways. At first it was subtle. Board members who had once remained firmly opposed to his ideas began to soften. One by one they began to recognize the strength of his commitment. They had seen the results from the pilot program, and they couldn't ignore the tangible improvements that had taken place. Some even began to stand by him, realizing that the changes were not just feasible but necessary for the long-term success of the company. Harlan, ever persistent, had worked tirelessly to prove his point, showing the executives how his strategy could address the financial struggles they had long ignored. And now there were signs that they were finally listening. Sam and Mary, along with other employees, could feel the shift too. There was a noticeable change in their attitudes and the way they approached their work. The atmosphere in the company began to lift the heavy weight of despair, replaced by a faint but growing sense of hope. Harlan could feel it, the quiet shift from resistance to support, from despair to possibility. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be many more hurdles. Yet, for the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt the momentum of change building. This was the turning point, and Harlan was ready to keep pushing forward. The results from the trial implementation of his reforms exceeded even Harlan's expectations. When the financial reports came in, they showed growth beyond the projections. Not only were the numbers improving, but the morale within the company was also undergoing a significant transformation. Employees once weary and disconnected were now showing up with renewed energy, their commitment to the company growing with every passing day. Harlan could see the shift in their faces in their work, and it filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he felt like his vision was becoming a reality. The board members who had been so skeptical now had to acknowledge that the changes were having the desired effect. But it wasn't just about the profits. The deeper, more lasting impact was the sense of community that had begun to take root. In a company where isolation had once reigned, now there was a palpable sense of teamwork and shared purpose. Harlan found himself standing in the midst of it, watching as Sam, Mary, and others worked with a new sense of pride. The transformation was tangible. As he walked into the meeting room, he could feel a shift in the air, one that he hadn't expected, but that was more than welcome. Change had arrived, and it was here to stay. Just when Harlan thought the path to reform was clear, disaster struck. A trusted board member who had been quietly opposing the changes suddenly revealed that he had secretly sold off a portion of the company's assets without Harlan's knowledge. The shock hit Harlan like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, he couldn't comprehend what he had just learned. The betrayal felt like a betrayal of trust, not just between him and the board, but between him and the very values he had been fighting for. This was a calculated move to undermine everything he had worked for. The realization hit him hard. There were still those in the company who were not committed to the changes, who had been playing both sides for their own benefit. Harlan's mind raced as he processed the gravity of the situation. He knew this would be a test of his resolve, but he couldn't allow this betrayal to derail the progress he had made. He gathered his thoughts, then set out to meet with his employees, determined to find out more. The sense of betrayal ran deep, but Harlan was no stranger to adversity. He would fight this just as he had fought for every other change. This was a test of his leadership, and he would not back down even if it meant facing greater opposition than ever before. The stakes had never been higher. Harlan stood in the boardroom, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. He had seen betrayal within his company, something he had never expected from those he trusted most. But this time, he would not back down. He called an emergency meeting, his heart racing as he prepared to confront the disloyal director. As the meeting unfolded, Harlan faced the man who had secretly undermined his efforts, pushing for the company's assets to be sold without his knowledge. With a calm but firm voice, Harlan demanded accountability. The director, once defiant, now crumbled under the pressure, admitting his actions. His resignation followed shortly after, and Harlan knew it was time to reshape the leadership structure, ensuring no one could undermine the changes again. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Harlan's unwavering stance had done something he hadn't anticipated. He had not only restored order, but also reinforced the trust of his employees. They saw in him a leader who would stand for what was right, no matter the cost. This moment of clarity and decision was more than just business, it was personal. It was a declaration that the future of the company would be built on integrity, not manipulation. Harlan's strength and resolve in the face of betrayal marked the beginning of the final phase of transformation within the company. After the turmoil of betrayal and the intense reforms that followed, Harlan began to see the tangible effects of his decisions. The company, once fraught with division and disillusionment, was now brimming with energy. Employees were showing up with renewed dedication, working not just for a paycheck but for the belief that change was possible. The once cynical attitudes of Sam and Mary had shifted. They, along with their colleagues, felt recognized for the first time in a long while. They weren't just doing their jobs, they were part of something greater. The company's financial results were beginning to improve as well, and Harlan knew these weren't just numbers on a page. These were the results of hard work, collective effort, and a renewed sense of hope. The board, still skeptical, could no longer deny the positive changes. But Harlan's focus had shifted. It was no longer about proving a point to them, it was about proving to his employees that they mattered. As Harlan walked through the office, he could see the change in the air. There was a unity now, a shared sense of purpose that hadn't existed before. The battle was far from over, but the foundation for something new had been laid. Harlan had created a space where people could thrive, not just survive, and that more than anything gave him hope for the future. The company's transformation reached its true turning point when Harlan decided to take the next step, a company-wide meeting to reaffirm his commitment to his employees. Standing in front of them, Harlan felt a sense of pride and humility. This was the moment to show them that they weren't just workers, they were integral to the company's future. Harlan spoke not just of the changes they had already made, but of a deeper commitment to ensure that no employee would ever feel overlooked again. He introduced a new employee support fund designed to help those facing personal hardships, allowing them to focus on their work without the constant worry of their personal struggles. Sam, Mary, and the others saw this, and for the first time in a long while they felt a sense of real belonging. They were no longer just filling roles. They were valued, and they had a stake in the future. As Harlan finished his speech, he could see the change in their eyes. The tired, worn faces that had once walked through the office with resignation now gleamed with hope and purpose. The atmosphere in the company had shifted completely. No longer was it a place of strife and distrust. It had become a place of solidarity where every person mattered. Harlan had not only restored his employees' faith in the company, but also in the idea that real change was possible. Harlan sat in his office, gazing out the window at the city below his mind, heavy with reflection. The journey he had embarked upon had been filled with challenges, some expected, others not. But through it all, he had made decisions that shifted the course of his company, decisions that now seemed to have set him on the right path. Yet, despite the victories, he knew the battle was far from over. There was still much work to be done, much more to be rebuilt. The company had changed, but true transformation would require constant effort, not just from him, but from everyone. He thought of his employees, Sam, Mary, and the others who had stood by him, trusting in the changes that had begun to take root. Harlan knew that his success wasn't his alone. It was theirs, too. They had shown patience, belief, and strength in the face of adversity. He had only done what he could to create a space where they could thrive. Now, as he took a deep breath, he realized that the next steps would be just as crucial. This was just the beginning, and while pride filled his chest for what had been achieved, the work ahead still loomed large. There was no easy finish line. But in that quiet moment, Harlan knew he was no longer just a leader. He was a part of something much greater than himself. Harlan had begun to see the fruits of his labor. The programs he had introduced to empower his employees, especially the training initiatives, were beginning to show results. Sam and Mary were not just employees anymore, they were leaders in their own right, taking on new responsibilities that helped shape the future of the company. Sam was leading an important project, a testament to the faith Harlan had in him, and Mary had been given the chance to manage a new team, her confidence growing with each passing day. It wasn't just Sam and Mary, every employee now had a real opportunity to grow to become something more than just another worker. Harlan knew that when people were given the tools to succeed, they would rise. And that's exactly what happened. The company had shifted from a place of stagnation to one of growth, energy, and purpose. As Harlan watched his team evolve, he realized that this wasn't just a transformation of the company, it was a transformation of people's lives. The sense of fulfillment he felt was not about profit margins or quarterly reports. It was about seeing people reach their potential, something he never thought possible when he first started this journey. Harlan wasn't just the boss anymore. He was the guide, helping others discover their own path. That evening, Harlan found himself sitting down to a company dinner with his employees. The once tense atmosphere that had filled the offices for so long was now replaced with laughter and camaraderie. They exchanged stories, talked about their dreams, and celebrated the milestones they had reached together. The sense of unity was palpable, and as Harlan looked around, he realized that this moment was the culmination of everything he had worked for. Sam, Mary, and the others were no longer just workers, they were partners in this journey. For the first time in a long while, Harlan felt that the company was no longer just a place to work. It had become a family, a community of people who believed in one another. As they shared a meal together, Harlan saw the pride in their eyes, the same pride that had once felt out of reach. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead, but for now there was a sense of peace. They had overcome the darkest moments together, and now they were looking ahead with hope and determination. Harlan smiled, knowing that the change they had fought for was no longer just a dream. It was their reality. And as the laughter echoed through the room, he knew that they had all found something they hadn't realized. They were searching for a place where they truly belonged. The company had begun to expand, and Harlan was already planning for the long term. He knew that the progress they had made was just the beginning. With a renewed sense of purpose, he set his sights on opening new branches, furthering the changes he had worked so hard to implement. Sam and Mary, once employees with hopes and dreams, now found themselves leading critical projects. They had become key figures in the company's growth, guiding others with the same hope and drive that Harlan had instilled in them. As Harlan looked to the future, a quiet optimism settled within him. The change he had sparked had taken root. The company was no longer just a place of work. It was a model for leadership, innovation, and growth. It was a place where people mattered. He could see it now, a future full of opportunities for both the company and its people. The world had changed, and so had he, but the journey wasn't over. There was still much more to be done, and the future was full of promise. As Harlan reflected on the journey that had brought his company to where it was, he realized something profound. The limits he had once placed on himself and his business no longer existed. He had moved beyond the barriers he once thought insurmountable, and in doing so had redefined what success truly meant. With the company now thriving, Harlan set his sights on an even greater mission, contributing to the community and society at large. His company had transformed from a place of profit to a place of purpose. It had become a model for others to follow, where kindness, fairness, and equality were at the forefront. The changes he had made had created not just a better company, but a better world. Harlan felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that the journey had created lasting change, not just within the walls of the company, but far beyond them. The work wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid for something truly transformative. Harlan stood at the window watching his employees work with a renewed sense of purpose under the glow of the late afternoon sun. This wasn't just a company, it was a testament to the change they had all fought for. The path ahead would be filled with new challenges, but this time he wasn't alone. With this team by his side, he knew they would rise above anything that came their way. Smiling to himself, he walked out of the office, ready for what was next. The journey was far from over, but with hope and unity they would face it together stronger than before.